Hello and welcome to another enthralling episode of Cindy and the News. It's a nice sunny June 5th day, and tonight it will be a warm 82 degrees with clear skies, so you can go out and enjoy that full strawberry moon. We'll see how the full moon ends up affecting the protesters. This past Tuesday, I marched with George Floyd's family in downtown Houston, along with 60,000 other people. I must say, it was quite invigorating. And as you can see from the photos, a good 80 to 90% of people were wearing a mask. There were also hand sanitizer stations set up with helpful volunteers at about 200-yard intervals. My friend Kenneth made me a sign that read, "When is the violent inherent in the system?" My catchy phrase didn't really catch on though. Other phrases that were a lot more efficient, however, were yelled out in the march. Stuff like, "No justice, no peace," "State his name, George Floyd," "Black Lives Matter," and "I can't breathe." This one was my favorite sign there. The protest was largely peaceful and remained so when I left at about 4:15 p.m. Later that night, however, things took a darker turn, and the previously peaceful cops became violent and began kettling protesters and shooting them with tear gas and rubber bullets. Unfortunately, this is nothing new, and protesters, having had enough of being tear gassed, have started donning tear gas masks. Much to the dismay of cops such as the ones in Colorado Springs, who cried they thought this was going to be a peaceful protest, despite the fact that most protests around the country have ended up tear gassing peaceful protesters. Perhaps the Colorado Springs Department is merely upset they no longer have the chance to brutalize protesters as efficiently. We now have 50 states and 18 countries that are protesting this movement, making it the biggest civil rights movement in history. This includes countries such as Greece, France, Spain, England, and many others. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., a bunch of mysterious cops have shown up without name tags and won't say what department they're in, despite the First Amendment Rights and Police Standards Act of 2004, which states all Metropolitan Police Department members, while in uniform, wear or display their nameplate and badge and not remove or cover this identifying information or prevent persons from reading it. This comes after Trump hid in a bunker for an hour last Friday, and then a bunch of protesters outside the White House disappeared. Trump later claimed that he was not hiding in a bunker. He was merely checking it out during the day to make sure it was up to standards. So because he was outed as a coward and was embarrassed about that, he held a new conference where he threatened to unleash the National Guard on the citizens of the U.S. and declared himself a president of law and order. He then had some nearby protesters sitting peacefully outside of a church tear gassed, so he could walk to a church he's never been to and hold up a book he's never read, upside down by the way. The tear gassing of peaceful protesters is of course a major violation of the First Amendment rights to free speech and peaceful assembly. The threat for the president to mobilize troops in the U.S. is also a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, which prevents the president from deploying the military in domestic law enforcement situations unless expressly authorized in the Constitution or an act of Congress. Trump is attempting to counter this with the Insurrection Act of 1807, which says, "When there is an insurrection in any state against its government, the president may, upon the request of its legislator or of its governor, if the legislator can't be convened, call into federal service such of the militia of the other states in the number requested by that state, and use such of the armed forces as he considers necessary to suppress the insurrection." This 213-year-old federal law allows the president to deploy active military troops on U.S. soil and is normally enacted when local law authorities are seen as unable to handle an uprising. The last time it's been enacted was in 1831 during the Nat Turner slave rebellions, 1957 for the Little Rock Nine, and 1992 during the Rodney King riots. The CIA veterans who monitored the crackdowns abroad have said that the president's handling of all this, I've seen this kind of violence. This is what autocrats do. This is what happens in countries before collapse. The Defense Secretary, 4-star General Mattis, meanwhile, resigned after the president's threats to deploy the National Guard, saying, "I had no choice but to leave." Mad Dog Mattis said he has watched this week's unfolding events, angry and appalled, and we must reject or hold accountable those in office who would make a mockery of our Constitution. The Nazi slogan for destroying us was divide and conquer, and our American answer is union. In union there is strength. Mattis concluded that the American experiment is directly threatened by the actions of the president and handed his resignation. Trump, of course, had to put his own spin on things and insisted it was he who had fired Mattis, and also gave him the nickname change from Chaos Mattis to Mad Dog Mattis. Despite the fact General Mattis has had the nickname since 2004, and Trump is renowned for making up dumb nicknames, not clever ones. The National Guard has since shown up in Louisville, Kentucky, where they shot and killed victim David McAtee, the owner of a local barbecue business. This was a response to some unknown firing at the National Guard first. The D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser is now attempting to invoke the Third Amendment, preventing the quartering of soldiers in a time of peace, in order to evict all non-local National Guard. Meanwhile, even more protesters have shown outside the White House, to which President Trump has responded by setting up a second fence around the perimeter of the first fence that surrounds the White House. So I guess he got his wall after all. Cops themselves are becoming more violent in the protests and were captured brutally shoving an old man to the cement, cracking his skull, and left there as blood pooled around his head. Several cops who were not involved continued to uncaringly walk past the man. Police later insisted that the man tripped and fell on his own. More recent reports have shown that he is recovering and will be fine. Police have also started attacking medic stations, destroying medical supplies and cutting open water bottles, stealing water and destroying milk and tear gas protection, and firing flashbangs and rubber bullets at the medics. Things definitely seem dire at the moment. Meanwhile, Seth Rogan has jumped on board the Black Lives Movement, which for whatever reason is a controversial movement and seems to make people angry, warranting the tired-old phrase of all lives matter, despite the fact that it is not all lives that are disproportionately subjected to police brutality. It is mostly black lives. All lives will not matter until Black Lives Matter. Seth Rogan agrees with this sentiment and replied to anyone commenting to his wild concept of Black Lives Matter with All Lives Matter with such memorable phrases as "fuck you" and "fuck off." They even made a video of him in live action.
Larry, what the hell are you doing?
Larry!
Larry, you can't just... Oh,
Larry! Oh, are you all right? How did...
Larry!
The protests are having some positive effects, however, as not only have the other 3 officers involved in the death of George Floyd been charged, and his murder has had his charge changed from to a second-degree murder from a third-degree murder, but there may also be justice for Brianna Taylor. Brianna Taylor, a black nurse who was killed in her home in Louisville back in March. The 26-year-old was shot 8 times by narcotic detectives who knocked down her front door looking for drugs that weren't there. Her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, was arrested for firing at the cops in self-defense, despite the fact that they barged in without announcing themselves. These charges against Walker have since been dropped, and judges have reopened the case for Ms. Taylor, although the police involved have yet to be arrested. Police, however, are at least suspending the use of no-knock search warrants. So in other non-devastating fall of the U.S. dystopian collapse news, Carol Baskins. was awarded the zoo that once belonged to Joe Exotic, the Tiger King. This comes as a shock to many, since Carol Baskins killed her husband, whacked him. Can't convince me it didn't happen. Fed them to tigers, they're snacking it. What happening? A high school in Key West, Florida held a graduation via jet skis. The alligator who supposedly belonged to Hitler has sadly died. He survived World War I and escaped the Berlin Zoo in November 1943 during the Allied air raids. He spent his retirement happily in the Berlin Zoo. A group of monkeys in India stole blood samples from infected COVID-19 patients at a local medical college. I'm sure it's fine. In Knoxville, Tennessee, police found the remains of a second child buried in a yard. Michael and Shirley Gray had lived in the house until 2016 and were arrested a couple weeks ago for aggravated child abuse, neglect, kidnapping, and abuse of a corpse. The remains likely belong to their adopted son, Jonathan Gray, who most likely died about 4 or 5 years ago. And his death was not reported so that the Grays could continue receiving benefits from the state. The boy was apparently locked in a partially flooded basement and was only fed some stale white bread and a little bit of water. Immigrant detainees say ICE is using a coronavirus disinfectant spray that causes bleeding, burns, and pain. One detainee said that when she blows her nose, blood comes out. There's almost no ventilation in the buildings, and the spray being used, HDQ neutral, states on the bottle it should be used in well-ventilated areas. India is fighting off its worst locust invasion in 30 years by using drones and fire trucks. The locusts are threatening vital crops and vegetation, and millions are seen crossing into India's western state of Rajasthan from Pakistan. And finally, Hurricane Cristobal. Looks like it's going to hit Louisiana on Sunday. Right now, it's overland in Mexico, and it's just a tropical depression. However, it may strengthen to a tropical storm as it moves across the Gulf of Mexico. It will reach 39 miles per hour wind, and when it hits landfall, it is projected to have 60 miles per hour. Category 1 hurricane has 74 miles per hour winds. Today's count. We have 1,965,551 U.S. cases with 111,385 U.S. deaths. And finally, remember this. Discontent is the first step towards progress. And in the words of Teen Edwards, know your worth. You must find the courage to leave the table if respect is no longer being served. This has been Cindy in the News. Thank you for joining me tonight, and don't forget to check out that moon.